Welcome to another edition of Whiskey, Games, and Nerd Stuff. Today's whiskey is continuing the Stillhouse America's Finest Whiskey in the oil can. And today's Nerd Stuff is going to briefly talk about this book that I've been reading, which is really cool, called The 90s by Chuck Klosterman. Let's go ahead and take our drink. So I really wasn't a fan of this at the beginning. Just kind of wasn't my thing. But I did notice, and I've had it a few times since, if I let it sit on ice, I like it a lot better. I do know some people who really like this one. This is just not something that I would run out there and get. I do love this can, though. I think this is great on the bar. So any of those that have a home bar, or any of those that just like something unique. I'm kind of a nerd, as you can tell by the videos. I typically keep one bottle of everything I've ever drank. So I have hundreds, if not thousands, of different unique whiskey bottles, wine bottles, Coke bottles, you name it. I just thought it was cool to have that in the man cave kind of thing in the bar, of just all those empty bottles and stuff in there. So this is something I'll definitely keep, kind of like this. And I actually came. I want to talk about this book. I've been reading this book off and on for the last little bit. Really enjoying it. Definitely brings back some memories. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about a particular chapter in this one is I was out to a work lunch with some colleagues the other day, and somehow we got on the topic of Crystal Pepsi. Did anybody remember Crystal Pepsi and when it came out? And I think somebody even Googled it and looked it up. And just by pure chance, there was a chapter in here that specifically talked about Crystal Pepsi, which I thought was kind of interesting. And it was one of those things where we see these coincidences all the time. It's kind of like when you go out there and you buy a car. Before you buy a particular model of a car, you probably don't see it that often, but once you buy it, you feel like you see it everywhere. So I'm sure somebody has mentioned Crystal Pepsi before in conversations over the years. The reason this particular stuck out was because of what I was reading in this chapter. So let's take another drink. I'll go ahead and open this up. And this is from chapter 8 of yesterday's Concepts of Tomorrow. And I'll go ahead and just kind of read the first two pages. There's a question with all non-essential transactions that's hard to avoid and harder to answer. Do consumers demand what they want, or are consumers convinced to want whatever they're offered? Part of the problem is semantic. What does it really mean to want something you don't need? Another part is economic. A rich person might demand what a poor person wouldn't even consider, and vice versa. The real complexity, however, is that both contradictory possibilities are always plausible, and sometimes at the same time. It happens constantly, although rarely with as much clarity as with the beverage industry in 1993. There's no evidence that people in the 90s wanted clear versions of beverages that were readily available in non-clear form. It wasn't something that was possible to want because it's not something people imagined. There are many reasons people did not drink Pepsi, but it's too dark has never been among them. There have always been a demand for lighter beer, but nobody had ever asked for a beer so light that it's possible to look through the bottle and read a newspaper. So why were such beverages invented? Why from roughly 1992 to 1995 did the beverage industry operate from the position that there was an undiscovered sector of the populace who desperately wanted transparent drinks? When forced to construct an explanation, the conventional wisdom is always purity. Clear beverages were erroneously viewed as healthier, since they didn't have artificial coloring and ostensibly resembled water. And it's possible this was true for somebody somewhere. But that's not why this happened, nor does it explain why this trend collapsed. A concept like Zima, a citrusy version of coarse beer, scrubbed into translucence by charcoal filters, was the liquid manifestation of our cultural phase, in which informed insincerity was the only way to understand anything. Zima was ridiculous, but did that actually mean it was brilliant? The only viable conclusion was sort of. Coors Brewing Company announced the invention of Zima in 1992. Describing it as a malt-based spritzer, The word Zima displayed on the packaging is a futuristic font translated as winter in Russian. Zima had roughly the same alcohol content as normal beer, 4.7% by volume, and was intended for consumption in the same venues by the same type of beer-obsessed, Coors specifically instructed liquor stores never to place Zima next to wine coolers. The flavor was nothing like beer. It was closer to cheap champagne mixed with Sprite. And unlike beer, it was the opposite of an acquired taste. Every new Zima went down significantly worse than the previous Zima. There was, however, something perversely enticing about a drink that seemed to come from a post-apocalyptic wasteland in which color did not exist. There was an ingrained assumption that the Zima must be expressly targeted at somebody, but nobody knew who that was. Was Zima supposed to be for women? Was it secretly directed at minors, or maybe towards the gay community? Was there a demographic of insecure connoisseurs who didn't like beer but still identified as macho beer drinkers? Could you get drunk on Zima and pass a breathalyzer test? Was it actually for stealth alcoholics who wanted to drink at the office? At first, Zima's insecurity was its greatest advantage. In 1994, Coors sold a mind-boggling 1.3 million barrels of a beverage nobody understood. I had 15 the other night, and the thing is, you can drive with it. Your breath doesn't smell like alcohol. A 36-year-old farmer mover told the Village Voice. The only thing that irritates me is why don't they stop the bullshit and tell us what it is? So I know I started talking about Crystal Pepsi, but I forgot this started to talk about Zima and then goes into Crystal Pepsi. So we'll get into that in just a second. And go ahead and put this down for a second and have a drink. This reaction was common. People did not look at Zima and assume it was pure, healthier version of a regular beer. People looked at Zima and assumed it was a bizarre and possibly insidious. What secret ingredient made beer invisible? What was going on in here? In reality, Zima was just a cheaper version of regular Coors, stripped of all its identifiable characteristics and injected with a blast of citrus flavoring. It wasn't anything really, but that's why it temporarily worked. It was an unexplained idea. Now we're going to get into the Crystal Pepsi stuff. I forgot about the Zima, but it's right. I remember having a Zima the first time and thinking, my first thought was, why am I even drinking this? Crystal Pepsi employed the same philosophy. Although with $40 million worth of marketing and even less technological innovation, after a soft launch in 1992, PepsiCo went for the jugular during the 1993 Bills-Cowboys Super Bowl with a commercial scored by Van Halen, made to look identical to the band's video for Right Now, MTV's 1992 winner for the video of the year. There's some trivia for you. The relationship between the music and the drink became unbreakable. Right Now was a mature, piano-driven rock track with a message about embracing the present moment, including Crystal Pepsi, with a forced sense of modernity. The advertisement was so reminiscent of the music video that the original video started to feel like an advertisement. The drink itself was an undiluted illusion. It was regular Pepsi minus the food coloring and 27 calories. But the amounts of high fructose corn syrup and caffeine were identical. The fact that many consumers perceived Crystal Pepsi as having a different flavor from the original soda was consequence of psychology, which also led to its doom. Let's take another drink, and I want to talk about that for a second. So as I read this, it was regular Pepsi minus the food coloring and 27 calories. But the amount of high fructose corn syrup and caffeine were identical. The fact that many consumers perceived Crystal Pepsi as having a different flavor from the original cola was a consequence of psychology, which also led to its doom. I remember having arguments with people about Crystal Pepsi tasting exactly like Pepsi. I wish I remember this back then, because I have friends who to this day will still insist when the subject has come up that it tasted different and they can tell. But this is telling me right now that it was exactly the same taste. The only difference was you didn't have that charcoal in there. That's why it was clear. When first released, Crystal Pepsi performed remarkably well. It immediately captured 1% of the total soda market, equating to almost $500 million a year. As with Zima, people were curious. Its newness was it was inarguable, but there were flaws. Crystal Pepsi was presented as a visual product. It looked like 7-Up, so that's what people anticipated it would taste like. Yet despite its clarity, it tasted like regular cola, and the human mind does not respond positively to familiar products that contradict expectations. You could probably do a series of videos just on that statement alone. It generates psychological anxiety. Pepsi was A, telling people to drink something that unconsciously disturbed them, while B, latently suggesting this new disturbing product was a healthier alternative to regular Pepsi. The foundation for their entire business model, making matters worse, was Coca-Cola's 19 introduction of Tab Clear, another translucent beverage with an overly sinister purpose. It was terrible on purpose. Now, I don't remember Tab Clear. And before I did this video, I called a couple of friends, and not one of us remembers Tab Clear. So I guess that tells you why it didn't succeed very well. But what is interesting is this next chapter. Tab Clear was a diet cola with no caffeine and a heavy aftertaste. Almost no one wanted regular Tab, much less a colorless version of what it already was. But visibly, Tab Clear seemed like competition for Crystal Pepsi. So the two products were predictably placed next to each other in retail stores and intertwined into the minds of the public. Crystal Pepsi was just a gimmicky version of regular Pepsi, but Coca-Cola persuaded people to incorrectly view it as a caffeine-free diet drink that resembled their worst product. We launched a Tab Clear product and positioned it right next to the Crystal Pepsi, and we'd kill both in the process, Coca-Cola marketing strategist Sergio Zyman explained in the 2011 book Killing Giants. It was a suicidal mission from day one. People spent an enormous amount of money on the brand, and regardless, we killed it. Both of them dead within 6 months. So I kind of thought that was interesting on a couple levels. Let me go ahead and put this back over here, and we will take a drink. So I thought it was interesting that... actually, let me take the drink real quick. So I didn't even know about Tab Clear, but I find it interesting that one of the reasons that Crystal Pepsi didn't succeed is people thought it was going to be something different, and it wasn't, or they thought it would taste like 7-Up. It doesn't mention it in the chapter, but I'm sure there's people that thought it tasted like Sprite as well. And what's interesting too is the fact that the marketing executive over at Coca-Cola knew this. Knew Tab wasn't the greatest of drinks. And again, I don't know anybody who's liked Tab. If you do, would love to hear their comment. You'll probably be the first person I've met who ever liked it. And the fact that they intentionally created a clear Tab, put it next to the Crystal Pepsi, and what that did is then in turn play into the psychology of what people's expectations were, and then people immediately associated that Tab Clear horrible taste with Crystal Pepsi, which was just basically Pepsi but without the color. So I kind of thought that was interesting. And the thing about the Zima too, I found interesting, and actually that came up in the same conversation as the Crystal Pepsi did. So I thought it was kind of curious. Later in the chapter, he goes and talks about they had things like clear dish or clear soaps, clear gasoline, and other things. I really enjoyed this book. He kind of goes into a lot of different things about the 90s. I may do another video or two on these. There's some pretty cool stuff in there. He does a section on the Titanic, and I just refuse to watch that movie and talk about it, so I'm not going to do the video on that. But if it's something you're interested in, it is really kind of interesting where he talks about that. He also gets into the Matrix, but he gets into a lot of things in this particular book about the 90s. Definitely kind of gives you a different perspective from an outsider's view. Let's go ahead and take one more drink. And again, this Stillhouse isn't my favorite, but I do notice when I set it with ice, I kind of like it. It would be a good mixer. It's worth at least trying one time, and I definitely would get this just to have it on your shelf. This book I would highly recommend. I'm probably going to do at least one more video on it. And like I said, it's been enjoyable. Really would be interested in to see if anybody remembers Crystal Pepsi or Zima, and what their experiences with it were, and if they liked it or they didn't like it. Really would appreciate too if you like, subscribe, all that fun stuff on the videos. And please feel free to make any comments about this book or anything else that you would like me to cover. And until next time, cheers.